She thought her betrayal was their secret, but he turned her world into a living nightmare. What happens when revenge goes too far? For the first 10 years, I thought I was living the dream. My wife, Lauren, and I were the couple everyone admired. We met in college, bonded over our shared love of adventure and travel, and got married in a small, intimate ceremony on a sunlit cliffside. She was the life of every party, charismatic and sharp-tongued in a way that made people laugh but left them slightly off balance. I, on the other hand, was quieter, the grounding force in our relationship. We both had successful careers, Lauren as a corporate consultant and me as a software developer. We bought a cozy house in the suburbs, where we hosted friends for wine nights and game evenings. From the outside, our life seemed perfect, and for a long time I thought it was. The cracks started showing last year when Lauren suggested we attend a couples growth retreat. She framed it as an exciting opportunity to deepen our connection, claiming, "It's not because anything is wrong. It's just proactive, like a tune-up for our relationship." At first, I was skeptical. We didn't seem like the type of couple that needed a retreat. Our arguments were rare, and while Lauren could be blunt, I loved her confidence. Still, I didn't want to be the guy who resisted working on his marriage, so I agreed. The retreat was at a luxurious lodge in the mountains, surrounded by pine trees and breathtaking views. It promised to reignite passion and foster emotional transparency, and Lauren seemed genuinely excited. On the surface, the retreat felt promising. The days were packed with workshops, trust exercises, and group discussions. But then came the first signs of something off. Lauren started dressing differently, more provocatively than usual, and suddenly seemed uninterested in the sessions we attended together. She'd disappear during breaks, claiming she was socializing with other couples or networking with the organizers. At night, in our cabin, she was distant. When I tried to bring it up, she dismissed me with a laugh. "Don't be paranoid, Ethan," she'd say. "I'm just being friendly. Isn't that what this retreat is all about?" I told myself I was imagining things. After all, Lauren had always been outgoing, and she loved making new friends. But something about her tone, the way her smiles never quite reached her eyes, kept me awake at night. I couldn't shake the feeling that our perfect marriage wasn't as unbreakable as I once believed. The third night of the retreat, I woke up to an empty bed. The clock on the bedside table blinked 2:17 a.m. At first, I thought Lauren had gone to the bathroom, but the soft hum of conversation drew me to the window. Peering through the blinds, I saw her on the patio, wrapped in a shawl, leaning in close to a man I recognized from the retreat. His name was Blake, one of the retreat organizers. A tall, overly charming guy with an easy smile and an unsettling knack for remembering intimate details about the couples. I'd noticed Lauren laughing at his jokes during group sessions, but I had chalked it up to her usual extroverted nature. Now, they were sitting on the patio furniture, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they talked. She was smiling in that way she used to smile at me during the early days of our relationship. Warm, electric, and full of mischief. I should have gone out there. I should have demanded to know what the hell was going on. But instead, I stood frozen, staring at the scene like a coward. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was overreacting. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but the image of her with Blake played in my mind on a loop. Over breakfast, I casually asked, "Did you sleep well last night?" Lauren didn't even blink. "Yeah, why?" I forced a smile. "No reason. I thought I heard you get up." "Oh, I just want to get some air," she said, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. The cabin was so stuffy. Her ease rattled me. Lauren had always been good at lying when she wanted to, but I could usually tell when she wasn't being truthful. This time, though, I couldn't. Throughout the day, I watched her. I saw how she laughed a little too loudly at Blake's jokes during a group discussion, how her eyes lingered on him just a moment too long. But when I brought it up later, she snapped at me. "Ethan, for God's sake, not everything is about you," she said, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Can you not handle me talking to someone without getting jealous?" Her words stung, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to come across as controlling. Still, the growing unease gnawed at me. The turning point came during the evening's group activity. We were supposed to write anonymous notes to our partners, expressing what we appreciated most about them. When Lauren read hers out loud, her words felt distant, almost generic, like she was going through the motions. I, on the other hand, poured my heart into my note. I wrote about the woman I fell in love with, the one who made every moment brighter just by being in it. But when she read it, her eyes didn't even well up. She folded the note neatly, placed it on the table, and didn't say a word. That night, I resolved to find out what was really going on. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every interaction between Lauren and Blake replayed in my head, fueling the gnawing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Around midnight, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. Lauren was asleep, or at least pretending to be. Her breathing was slow and even, her face turned away from me. Carefully, I slipped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and stepped into the small bathroom attached to our cabin. My heart raced as I unlocked her phone, praying she hadn't changed the passcode. To my relief, it opened on the first try. First, I didn't find anything. No incriminating texts, no unusual photos. Just the usual notifications from her friends and work. I was starting to feel foolish when I noticed something odd. A folder in her email labeled workshop notes. Curious, I opened it. It was filled with benign-looking emails about the retreat event schedules, guest lists, and updates. But one email, buried halfway down, was flagged as important. It was from Blake. The subject line read, "Looking forward to tonight." I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. With trembling hands, I opened the email. It was brief but damning. "Lauren, can't stop thinking about our conversation last night. Meet me by the fire pit after the group session. I'll bring the wine this time." Winky face. Blake. The air felt thick, suffocating. I scrolled further, finding more emails, casual at first, then increasingly flirtatious. "Last night was incredible. You're intoxicating. I can't get enough of you. When this retreat is over, I want more." The timestamps confirmed it. Their affair wasn't just emotional, it was physical. It had been happening for months, even before the retreat. My hands shook as I snapped screenshots and forwarded them to myself. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. How could she do this? How could we come here to strengthen our marriage while she was sneaking around with another man? I locked her phone, placed it back on the nightstand, and stared at her sleeping figure. She looked so peaceful, so untroubled, as though she hadn't just blown up our life together. I felt sick. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window, staring into the darkness, my mind spiraling as I tried to figure out what to do next. By the time the sun rose, I had rehearsed the confrontation in my mind 100 times. Each version played out differently: anger, heartbreak, cold detachment. But nothing could have prepared me for the real thing. Lauren woke up around 7 a.m., stretching languidly and smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. "Morning," she said, her voice light and casual. Couldn't fake it. "Morning," I replied, my voice flat. She frowned slightly but didn't press. Instead, she grabbed her phone and headed to the bathroom, the same phone I had scoured hours earlier. When she emerged, dressed and ready for breakfast, I stood by the cabin door, blocking her path. "Lauren, we need to talk." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "What's with the tone?" "Don't do that," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and pain. "Don't pretend you don't know what this is about." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, if you have something to say, just say it." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Without a word, I opened the email screenshots and held it out to her. Her face paled as she read the first one, then the second. By the third, she was visibly trembling. "Where did you? Does it matter?" I snapped. "How long, Lauren? How long have you been screwing Blake behind my back?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and said, "It's not what you think. Don't insult me with that line." I cut her off. "I read the emails. I saw everything. How could you? How could you bring me to this retreat? sit across from me in those sessions, and pretend like we were fixing things. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. It just did." "That's your excuse?" I barked. "It just happened? You made a choice, Lauren. Every time you wrote to him, every time you met up with him, you chose this." "I was unhappy," she shouted suddenly, her tears turning into anger. "Do you even realize how suffocating our life has become? The same routine day after day. I felt invisible, Ethan. Like I didn't even exist. And cheating fixed that?" I asked, my voice rising. "Destroying our marriage was your solution?" She crossed her arms, glaring at me. "Maybe if you paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." Her words hit like a slap to the face. The sheer audacity of her blaming me for her affair left me momentarily speechless. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You know what, Lauren? I could have worked with unhappiness. I could have worked with distance, resentment, even anger. But this betrayal, there's no coming back from it." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Save it. I don't want to hear your excuses. We're done, Lauren. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine." I grabbed my jacket and stormed out of the cabin, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. As I walked aimlessly through the retreat grounds, the rage simmering in my chest turned into something darker, colder. I knew I couldn't just let this slide. If she thought she could humiliate me and walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. By the time I returned to the cabin that evening, I had a plan. The fury that had consumed me earlier had settled into a cold, calculated determination. Lauren was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the fireplace. She didn't look up when I entered. I didn't speak to her. Instead, I grabbed a beer from the mini-fridge and sat at the small dining table, letting the silence stretch between us. I needed her to feel the weight of it, to understand that whatever fragile thread remained between us was about to snap. She finally broke the silence. "So what now?" I took a slow sip of my beer, staring at her over the rim. Now I take back control." Her brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means you've humiliated me, Lauren. You've lied, cheated, and dragged me to this godforsaken retreat to play house while you screwed another man. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" Her face paled, and she shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan, Save it," I interrupted, my voice low and steady. "I'm not interested in your apologies or your excuses. I'm interested in making sure you understand what betrayal feels like." She flinched but didn't respond. That night, I began setting my plan in motion. While Lauren slept, or pretended to, I sat in the cabin's kitchenette with my laptop, gathering every piece of evidence I had. The emails, the timestamps, even photos I found online of Blake and Lauren laughing together at retreat events. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to hit her where it hurt. The next day, I approached Blake during one of the group exercises. He was his usual charming self, flashing his perfect smile and clapping me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "Ethan, how's it going?" he asked, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm facade. "Great," I lied, forcing a smile. "Actually, I wanted to thank you for helping Lauren and me reconnect. She's been really enjoying the retreat." Blake's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and I knew I had him. He didn't think I knew. "Of course," he said smoothly. "That's what we're here for." I nodded, pretending to buy his act. "Listen, I've got some ideas I wanted to run by you about future retreats. You seem like the kind of guy who's always looking for new opportunities." His eyes lit up at the bait. "Absolutely. Let's set up a time to chat." "Oh, no need," I said casually. "How about tonight? I'll bring some drinks, and we can brainstorm." "Sounds great," Blake said, his grin returning. "I'll see you then." I walked away, my pulse pounding. By the time we were done, Blake wouldn't just regret sleeping with my wife. He'd wish he'd never set foot in this retreat. That evening, as planned, I headed to Blake's cabin with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. My hands were steady, But my mind was racing. This wasn't just about him. This was about dismantling the fantasy Lauren had built for herself, piece by piece. Blake answered the door with his trademark grin. "Ethan, come on in," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. The cabin was surprisingly modest for someone who projected so much confidence. A single lamp lit the room, casting shadows across the walls. I placed the whiskey on the small table and sat across from him, forcing a friendly smile. We made small talk for a while, sipping the whiskey and pretending everything was fine. I could see his guard lowering with every passing minute. He was just arrogant enough to believe I was too oblivious to notice the affair. After the third glass, I decided it was time to strike. "So, Blake," I said, leaning back in my chair, "how long have you been running these retreats?" He chuckled. "About 5 years now. It's been rewarding work, you know? Helping couples reconnect." I nodded, swirling the whiskey in my glass. "And what about the ones who don't reconnect?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean the couples where one partner is distracted," I said, watching him closely. He froze for just a second, the smile slipping from his face before he recovered. "Well, that's unfortunate when it happens, but it's rare." "Why do you ask?" I leaned forward, my voice dropping. "Because I know about you and Lauren." His eyes widened, and he set his glass down slowly. "Ethan, I think you're misunderstanding something." "Don't insult me, Blake," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I've seen the emails. I know what's been going on. So spare me the denials." He stared at me, his confidence faltering. "Look, man, I didn't mean for this to happen. It's not personal." I laughed bitterly. "Not personal? You've been screwing my wife and humiliating me in the process. And you think it's not personal?" Blake opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Here's the deal, Blake. You're going to help me fix this. Not for her, but for me." He frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table, showing him the evidence I had collected. "If you don't, I'll make sure every couple who attends this retreat, every sponsor you work with, and every person in your professional network knows exactly what kind of help you offer." His face went pale. "Ethan, let's be reasonable." "Reasonable," I snapped, leaning closer. "Reasonable would have been not betraying me in the first place. This is the new reasonable. You're going to tell Lauren it's over. You're going to make her believe it was a mistake, that you're not interested anymore. And then you're going to disappear from our lives. Permanently." Blake swallowed hard, his bravado completely gone. "And if I don't?" I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Then I burn your entire life to the ground." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the lamp. Blake looked at me, searching for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. He nodded slowly. "Fine. I'll do it." I leaned back, feeling a cold satisfaction settle over me. "Good. We'll start tomorrow." The next morning, I watched Lauren and Blake from the edge of the retreat grounds. They stood near the fire pit where they had likely spent so many stolen moments. Now, however, the tension between them was palpable. I couldn't hear their conversation, but Lauren's body language told the story. She gestured wildly, her face a storm of confusion and anger. Blake, for his part, kept his head down, offering subdued replies and the occasional apologetic shrug. When Lauren finally stormed off, her face flushed and her fists clenched, I knew my plan was working. Back at the cabin, she burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her. "Ethan!" she shouted, her voice sharp and unsteady. I stayed seated at the dining table, pretending to work on my laptop. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning innocence. "What's wrong?" she repeated, incredulous. "Blake just told me he doesn't want to see me anymore, that it was a mistake, and he regrets everything." I raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that what you wanted? A man with integrity?" Her eyes narrowed, the realization dawning on her. You did this." I closed my laptop and stood, keeping my expression calm. "What if I did? What would you expect after what you've done?" "You had no right," she yelled, her voice trembling. No, right? I shot back, my voice rising. You dragged me to this retreat under false pretenses, lied to my face, and had an affair with the man running it, and you're accusing me of crossing a line. She opened her mouth to argue but then hesitated, her fury tempered by the truth in my words. For the first time in days she looked uncertain, vulnerable. Ethan, I didn't mean for things to get this bad, she said, her voice quieter now. I felt lost. And Blake made me feel seen, like I mattered. I scoffed, shaking my head. And I didn't? The man who's been by your side for over a decade? The man who gave you everything he had. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't let myself soften. Not yet. Here's the thing, Lauren, I continued, stepping closer. You don't get to blow up our life and walk away unscathed. You wanted excitement, passion? Well, you've got it now. Let's see how exciting it is when everything comes crashing down. Her tears spilled over, but I felt no sympathy. This was only the beginning. The retreat's final day brought the closing ceremony, an event designed to celebrate the couple's progress and share meaningful reflections. Everyone gathered in the lodge's main hall, the atmosphere warm and lively, but beneath it, I could feel the tension radiating from Lauren. She avoided my gaze, sitting stiffly beside me as the organizer. A woman named Janice took the stage. Janice delivered the usual platitudes about love and growth, encouraging couples to share their experiences from the retreat. When she called for volunteers, I raised my hand. Lauren whipped her head toward me, her eyes wide. What are you doing? She hissed under her breath. I smiled at her. Calm, measured, and deliberately unsettling. Sharing, I said softly before walking to the front of the room. The crowd applauded politely as I took the microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. I began, keeping my tone steady. I want to thank Janice and her team for organizing this retreat. It's been a truly eye-opening experience for me and, I'm sure, for many others. I glanced at Lauren, who was sitting rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. Blake stood near the back of the room, his expression unreadable. This retreat promised to help us reconnect, to uncover the truths about our relationships. I continued. And it delivered. I learned a lot about my marriage this week, things I never would have expected. The room was silent now, the other couples hanging on my every word. I learned, I said, my voice tightening just slightly, that sometimes the person you trust the most is the one who betrays you. I learned that lies have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they're hidden. Lauren's face had gone pale, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. And I learned, I said, locking eyes with her, that betrayal has consequences. I let the words hang in the air for a moment before turning to the crowd. But isn't that what love is about? Facing the ugly truths and deciding what to do with them. There was an awkward smattering of applause as I handed the microphone back to Janice and returned to my seat. Lauren didn't say a word, but her trembling hands spoke volumes. As the ceremony wrapped up, I watched as whispers rippled through the crowd. Blake disappeared before I could spot him again, and Lauren hurried out of the hall the moment we were dismissed. Later that evening, I found her in our cabin, sitting on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her face streaked with tears. Why are you doing this to me? She choked out. I closed the door and leaned against it, my arms crossed. You humiliated me, Lauren. You shattered everything we built. Did you really think I'd just let it slide? She sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but I quickly snuffed it out. This was what she deserved, or at least it was what I told myself she deserved. This is only the beginning, I said coldly. You wanted the truth to come out, didn't you? Well, it's out now, and we're both going to live with the fallout. I turned and left the cabin, leaving her to wallow in the mess she had created. By the time we returned home from the retreat, I had already begun laying the groundwork for the next phase of my plan. The whispers I'd planted at the closing ceremony were just the beginning. Lauren, desperate to salvage her reputation, tried to return to our life as if nothing had changed. She threw herself into her work, scheduling back-to-back meetings and pretending she hadn't just detonated our marriage. But I wasn't done. That week, I sent the email screenshots and the photos I'd found online to a carefully curated list of people. Her boss, a few close colleagues, and her group of friends who thrived on gossip. I wrote a simple message. Thought you might want to see the real Lauren. She's not who you think she is. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Lauren's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, her colleagues demanding explanations, her friends asking if the rumors were true. "What the hell did you do?" she screamed at me one night, shoving her phone in my face. I stared back at her, unflinching. "I told the truth. Isn't that what you always say you value?" Her face twisted in rage. "You're destroying my life." "No," I said calmly. "You destroyed your life when you decided to cheat. I'm just making sure everyone sees the wreckage." She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I didn't care where she went. The next day, I escalated further. I scheduled a meeting with Blake's wife, someone I'd deliberately avoided during the retreat. Her name was Naomi, and from what I'd gathered, she had no idea what kind of man she was married to. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. Naomi was beautiful in a sharp, professional way, her makeup flawless, her suit tailored. She smiled politely as I introduced myself, but her eyes narrowed as I slid the folder of evidence across the table. "What's this?" she asked, her tone wary. "Proof," I said simply. "Your husband and my wife had an affair. I thought you deserved to know." Her hands trembled as she opened the folder, flipping through the emails, the photos, and the notes I'd compiled. Her face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed her devastation. When she finished, she closed the folder and took a deep breath. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because he needs to face the consequences," I said. "And so does she." Naomi nodded slowly, her expression hardening. "You're right, they do." We spent the next hour discussing how to coordinate our efforts. Naomi, it turned out, was just as ruthless as I was, and together we crafted a plan to dismantle the lives they had built on lies. That evening, Lauren returned home looking exhausted. She dropped her purse on the counter and collapsed onto the couch, not even bothering to look at me. "Rough day?" I asked, my voice dripping with mock sympathy. She glared at me, her eyes red from tears. "I hate you," she whispered. I smiled, savoring the venom in her words. "Good. Now you know how I feel." Naomi didn't waste any time. The day after our meeting, she filed for divorce, citing Blake's affair with Lauren as the primary reason. She sent copies of the evidence I had provided to his colleagues, investors, and even the retreat's parent company. By the end of the week, Blake's professional life was in ruins. His retreats were put on indefinite hold, his investors pulled their funding, and his name became a cautionary tale among the elite circles he once thrived in. Lauren, meanwhile, wasn't faring much better. Her boss, a stickler for maintaining the company's pristine image, put her on temporary leave, pending an investigation into her personal conduct. Word spread quickly, and her colleagues, once her allies, now avoided her like the plague. She confronted me that evening, her face a mixture of fury and desperation. "You've destroyed everything," she spat, standing in the doorway of my home office. I didn't even look up from my laptop. "No, Lauren," I said evenly. "You destroyed everything. I just made sure the pieces couldn't be swept under the rug." Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You're sick. Do you know that? You're obsessed with revenge. This isn't normal." I finally met her gaze, my expression cold. "And was it normal when you paraded around with Blake, humiliating me in front of everyone? Was it normal when you turned our marriage into a joke?" She had no response. Instead, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The following week, Naomi and I met again, this time to finalize the next phase of our plan. She had tracked down several couples who had attended previous retreats, gathering testimonials about Blake's inappropriate behavior. Some were subtle, a flirtatious comment here, a lingering touch there, but others were more damning. "He's been preying on vulnerable women for years," Naomi said, her voice filled with disgust. Lauren's just the latest in a long line. The thought stung, but it also fueled my resolve. We expose him, I said. We make sure he can never do this to anyone else. Naomi nodded, her determination matching mine. 2 weeks later, an exposé about Blake's misconduct went live on a popular online news platform. It detailed his predatory behavior, backed by first-hand accounts from former clients and corroborated by the evidence Naomi and I had gathered. The article went viral, and within hours, Blake's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Lauren, caught in the crossfire, was mentioned in the piece as one of Blake's recent conquests. The humiliation was public, brutal, and inescapable. When she read the article, she broke down completely. I found her sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching her phone and sobbing. "Why are you doing this?" she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Haven't you hurt me enough?" I crouched down to meet her tear-streaked face, my own expression unreadable. "No, Lauren," I said quietly. "Not yet." By the time the dust from the exposé settled, Blake was a pariah. His name was synonymous with scandal, and his professional life was effectively over. Naomi had moved out of their shared home, leaving him to deal with the fallout alone. She sent me updates occasionally, always with a note of grim satisfaction. Lauren, on the other hand, was unraveling. With her reputation in tatters and her career hanging by a thread, she had retreated into herself, spending most of her days locked in the bedroom. I gave her no respite. Every time she emerged, I made sure she felt the weight of her actions. I didn't yell or lash out. I was calm, deliberate, and cutting with my words. One evening, she finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore," she screamed, throwing a glass against the wall. It shattered, the shards scattering across the floor. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with a cold detachment. "What exactly can't you do, Lauren? Face the consequences of your own choices." She turned to me, her face twisted with rage and despair. "You've made your point, Ethan. You've ruined me. Isn't that enough?" I stepped closer, my voice low and measured. "Not yet. You see, Lauren, this wasn't just about you cheating. It was about the way you lied to me, the way you disrespected me, the way you laughed behind my back while you tore our life apart. I want you to feel every ounce of what I felt, and then some." Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. "I get it," she said softly, tears streaming down her face. "You hate me. But Ethan, what's left for you after this? What happens when you've destroyed everything?" I didn't have an answer for her, at least not one I wanted to admit. The next morning, I found her packing a suitcase. "Where are you going?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Away," she said without looking at me. "I don't know where yet, but I can't stay here. Not with you." I watched her for a moment, a part of me tempted to stop her, to call off the war and try to rebuild. But the anger, the betrayal was still too raw. "Good," I said finally. "You've overstayed your welcome." She flinched but didn't respond. Within an hour, she was gone. With Lauren out of the picture, I expected to feel some sense of relief, maybe even satisfaction. But instead, I felt hollow. The house was eerily quiet, the silence a constant reminder of what I had lost. Not just Lauren, but the life we had built together. Naomi called me that evening. "It's done," she said, her voice tired. "Blake signed the divorce papers. I'm officially free." "Congratulations," I said, though my tone lacked enthusiasm. She hesitated. "How are you holding up?" I didn't answer right away. "I thought this would feel better," I admitted finally. "But it doesn't. It just feels empty." Naomi sighed. "Revenge doesn't fix anything, Ethan. It just burns everything to the ground." I didn't respond. Deep down, I knew she was right. The house felt like a tomb. With Lauren gone, I spent most of my time pacing, replaying everything that had happened. I thought ruining her and Blake would bring me closure, but all it did was leave a void I couldn't fill. I tried to move forward. Naomi suggested therapy, but I wasn't ready to unpack the mess I'd made of my own life. One night, I opened my laptop and revisited the folder of evidence. The photos, the emails, it was all still there. For some reason, I couldn't delete it. It felt like the only thing tying me to a purpose, even if that purpose was destruction. That same night, Lauren texted me for the first time since leaving. "I hate what we became," she wrote, "but I hope someday you'll let go of the anger. It's killing you, Ethan. Please don't let it take the rest of your life too." I stared at the message for hours, my finger hovering over reply. I didn't respond. Weeks passed, but the bitterness stayed. I immersed myself in work, hoping to drown out the emptiness, but the silence of the house always crept back in. One night, after too many drinks, I opened Lauren's text again. Her words burned, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. I stumbled into the bedroom, pulled out her old photo album, and sat on the floor flipping through it. Each picture told a story, a life we'd built and destroyed. My chest tightened as I stared at a photo from our honeymoon. She looked so happy, her eyes full of life. I didn't recognize the woman she'd become, or the man I had turned into. The weight of it all hit me at once. I buried my face in my hands and wept for the first time since it all began. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. The anger, the revenge. It had consumed me, leaving nothing behind but ashes. I called Naomi. "You were right," I said. She paused before answering. "About what?" "Revenge. It didn't fix anything. It just broke me." Naomi sighed. "It's not too late, Ethan. You can let go." I didn't know how, but I knew I had to try. That day, I deleted the folder of evidence. It felt like ripping out a piece of myself, but when it was gone, I felt lighter. For the first time, I considered therapy, not just to make sense of what happened, but to figure out who I was without the anger. Therapy was harder than I thought. Talking about the betrayal, my rage, and the destruction I caused forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding. Lauren's actions had broken me, but my obsession with revenge had turned me into someone I barely recognized. Through it all, I began to understand that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting that I couldn't change the past, only how I moved forward. Months later, I found myself at the cafe where I had first met Naomi. She was smiling faintly, her divorce finalized and her own wounds beginning to heal. "How are you?" she asked. "Better," I said honestly. "Still figuring it out, but better." We talked for hours, not about revenge or betrayal, but about rebuilding. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. Walking home that evening, I paused to take a deep breath. The air felt cleaner somehow, lighter. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighed down by anger or regret. I didn't know where life would take me next, but I was ready to find out.